Morning. How you doing?
Good morning. How are you?
I'm all right. Just making it through the snow here that we had.
Yeah, I hear it's interesting weather from like Texas on east.
Yeah. You definitely got lucky, that's for sure.
I mean, it's cold. It's colder than usual here, but it's I don't know. It's not out of the question for a January day, but it's like 42 degrees right now, but it's still a high of 70.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, that's about common for over there, I would say, because I used to live out in California, so I'm definitely familiar with how January is for certain. But yeah, but thank you for being here still. I know we changed a few times, but hey, I appreciate you being flexible. All right. Can you still hear me?
I can.
All right, wonderful. Yep, so I'm gonna get right on to it, Rocky. But just for some intro here, of course, we're doing this as far as part of our capital and culture series. So I'm gonna go ahead and let's go ahead and start asking you the questions and just be natural and great like you always are, and we'll go from there. All right.
Okay.
So, if you could just start, Rocky, just by just announcing yourself and just explaining to those who will be watching this, exactly who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Dr. Raquel Rocky Armstrong, and I'm a former teacher, former school administrator, and I'm also a current assistant professor in educational leadership at Arizona State University. And I am also a candidate for state representative for Arizona's Legislative District 13, which covers Chandler, Sun Lakes, and Gilbert.
Wonderful. So, before public service entered the picture, who were you becoming personally, professionally? If you could just kind of just guide us through that journey.
Well, I think it's hard to actually recall when public service wasn't in the picture. I think I've always sort of been sort of gearing up for a life in public service as a young child. I think my family always felt I was a bit precocious. I would ask a lot of questions about sort of why folks in the community had access to some things and other folks did not, and really learned at an early age like what inequity look like, from a visual standpoint. And so I spent sort of my, middle school years, high school years, doing a lot of like volunteering in the public service space, doing a lot of advocacy work, which led me to selecting an undergraduate institution that was noted for public service, which was Wellesley College, which then amplified that for me and allowed me to kind of dial in specifically in the field of education. I chose that space particularly because it was, statistically the only, area that could make or break or change someone's circumstances in terms of breaking cycles of generational poverty and some of these other things. While education has certainly not worked for everyone, which is a lot of the advocacy work that I've done, it is the space where if you are able to gain access to certain rooms and fields, it can change an entire family's circumstances. And so transition my advocacy through the education space as a teacher and a coach, and then realizing that while I could certainly impact my students, that shaping cultures for schools is really the role of an administrator, and so I went into the administrative space, and recognizing that education is the recipient of policymakers, and most policymakers are not educators. Most aren't, and so recognizing that there was a lane to really take my experiences, my real practical experiences, along with research that I continue to cultivate, on a scholarly end, sort of into, the public service space.
That's wonderful to hear for certain. My next question is, that kind of leads off into this. What did teaching give you that ultimately shaped how you think about leadership? If you can expound upon that a little more.
Yeah. So, One of the things that I truly, that was really foundational for me was how powerful lived experience is in sort of driving change. I think sometimes, especially now, we talk a lot about data or data informed decision making in leadership spaces, but we often discount that qualitative data, the experiences that people have, that you can gather that aren't necessarily quantifiable in a traditional sense, but really give you insight into the needs that communities have. My students, when trust is built, they will tell you anything, right? They'll let what their barriers are, what are the hidden challenges, what's really going on. And it helped me really see from a bigger picture how all the different institutions intersect that impact whether or not that individual child could learn that day, that year, would be successful later on. And it allowed me to really, think about what does advocacy look like in the education space. If I just focused in on, as an English teacher, well, I need to get, my students able to, write research papers and read on a certain level. I'm missing the fact that housing is an issue, food insecurity is an issue, economic mobility for families is an issue, and all those things impact whether or not that child is successful. And I could use all the best practice strategies all day, but I'm going to be moderately successful if I don't really think about all those things. And that's a lot for a teacher, but in thinking about what it means from a leadership standpoint, it then shaped me as an administrator in terms of like what partnerships did I cultivate for the schools that I was in? How did I view like community led initiatives and ensuring that the community was involved in the work that we were doing in the school? I think sometimes we put so much emphasis on who's the expert or who knows the most, when really like knowledge can sometimes be a fluid thing. It's not necessarily tied to a degree. you know uh Sometimes the custodian who's worked at the school for 35 years probably
Yeah.
has more knowledge.
Yeah.
you know
Right.
so making sure that we're thinking about those things inclusively.
Right. Yeah, you made a lot of good points about the custodian knowing more knowledge for certain. So what made you feel like this timing was right to step into public life? You mentioned that a little earlier, but why now do you feel this leap to run for this particular office?
Yeah. So, that's a really great question. In the last election cycle, I did a lot of statewide voter outreach here in Arizona, where I had the opportunity to interact with voters bipartisanly, in terms of really trying to get out the vote, trying to ensure that marginalized voices felt that they had space to participate in our political process and that it mattered, especially on the local and state levels, even though it was a presidential election. And what I would hear consistently at doors and forums was how people felt that the election was important. They understood that, but they didn't necessarily feel that the candidates that they had to choose from represented their interests. And I think it was a powerful moment for me because I think we sometimes think of disengaged voters as people who are uninformed, and the people I engaged with, it wasn't that they were truly uninformed. It was, I just don't like these people.
Yeah,
And,
right.
and so being forced to make a choice, I think is something to consider. And, in those conversations, people would ask, well, you seem so passionate, why aren't you running? Why aren't you running? And so after the results of the 2024 election and realizing that the things that I was passionate about were truly the losers in that election, I had to say to myself, what's next in my step? Do I scream louder from the sidelines, or is leadership really about stepping up to do what others won't do, even when you're afraid? I think it is a scary time to run for office in thinking about how tribal we've become
Yep.
with our sides, right? And it's sometimes difficult to navigate that middle. And I think that, I think about those voices, those people I interacted with, and the trust that they had, not even knowing me, and realizing that there, if I didn't step up now, right, like that's what other people are thinking. No one is willing to step up, and so it takes courage to step into that space. In Arizona in particular, education is a top issue. Well, that's my area of expertise, and so recognizing that there is a need there, at our state capitol for, not just someone who specializes in those issues, but also someone who is willing to have the tough conversations, who's willing to work bipartisanly, despite the fact that often people feel at this point that somehow it makes you, soft, or you're not willing to stand, firmly. At the end of the day, if we all go to our corners, nothing gets done, truthfully. And so it's really trying to be able to pull people back to center and problem solve and how we move forward.
You're absolutely right about that. Education is often, Rocky, framed as policy. You frame it as economic mobility. If you could just expand a little more, what does that mean to you in real life lived terms?
Absolutely. So, the purpose of education is to set up the next generation for, you know, uh, what they're going to do in the workforce, right? And I think where we sometimes miss the ball, we went through, a phase around, everyone needs to go to college. Well, here's the challenge with that is the whole point of getting a degree is meant to allow you to be some sort of, expert or knowledge, have some knowledge in a particular field. But if, we're not ensuring that there are jobs associated with that, or it's a growing industry, we're often setting children up for, long-term debt. We see, the student loan debt is a big national conversation. And I think, a lot of places, particularly even in Arizona, there's a shift back to we need a wider model, right? And so, a lot of our school districts here in Arizona have partnerships, whether it be through the community college, whether it be through trade unions, or industry, to ensure that folks are set up for, certifications where they can even come out of school making a livable wage, with great benefits. Because again, you have to be able to afford to live. Most people, at least here, in my district, want to live within 15 to 20 minutes of where they work. And we have some amazing employers in the area, people like, Intel and Boeing, and we also have Microchip. And these places are growing industries, not just from a, technology end, but in manufacturing is growing, in Arizona. Well, they need to be able to hire folks, and part of that comes from the training that they get in schools, not just the sort of basic, reading, math, and all those sorts of things, but it's also the, like, critical thinking and problem solving that you then apply to, those industries. You can do real life problem solving. And I think, there are places that have figured that out and apply that. And, I've heard testimonials from industry on how successful that is, that allows folks to kind of move through, their programs. And that is what I think about with economic mobility, because that same person is now able to come out and buy their first home. They're able to, live comfortably and not necessarily have to move back, with their parents, because they're not making a salary that, they can live on, right? And so that is, to me, the purpose of education. If we continue to put out, students who are, maybe they're not ready for college, but then they can't get a job that pays a decent salary, that has an impact on, crime, that has an impact on, mental health in our communities, that has an impact. So all these systems really work together when we're talking about, ensuring that we are giving a hand up, not a hand out, and lessening the amount of dependence that we have on social services.
I love that. How do you navigate Rocky leadership and visibility, especially as a Black woman in spaces, quite frankly, that we all know that weren't built with you in mind?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. The first thing I would say is it can be challenging. You can't be everywhere, all the time. I think part of it starts with really cultivating, relationships with validators. And what I mean by that is, the people who are on board with, your vision, as a leader, or in my case for me, it's making sure they understand the message that I'm trying to espouse, and they share that with their neighbors, their community, their folks, because they're the trusted person, right? I'm just, I'm building that, but I'm going to trust, my neighbor I've known for 20 years before a stranger who comes to me, right? And so it's making sure that they have the language that I'm speaking, and they're able to, confidently and authentically, speak to, who I am and why they believe in my leadership. And, you know, I kind of, especially in this time, ideology is a touchy subject. I think it's one of those things where everybody's going to be wrong. And, I'm an unapologetically proud Black woman, but I feel like I don't also have to say that in every space I walk in. I walk in that truth. When I show up, I am that. So I don't necessarily, speak to it, but what I do is, I try to ensure that the experiences of those that I am working to represent, the amplify, that maybe have been sort of left out of the conversation, are present in the room. I tend to often ensure that I invite, communities of color or other folks who maybe have historically not been invited to a lot of these events, to ensure that they're present and can and have space. And I think that's what sort of the visibility means, and tangibly. But I think especially in this sort of midterm election cycle, more than ever, our interests are all aligned. People really want to be able to afford to live across the
Yeah.
board. I don't care what you look like. I don't care, your social class, from working class all the way to affluent. I mean, even affluent people who, might have significant nest eggs are really concerned about those things dwindling, right? So everyone is really kind of on the same page. We just feel very differently on how we get there.
What sacrifices or trade-offs that come with public service that you feel, Rocky, that people rarely even talk about? I mean, like, what are sacrifices or trade-offs, to reiterate, that you feel come with the acts of public service and the duties that are bestowed upon you, or that you proactively act upon, that you feel are unsung, or that
Mhm.
doesn't get enough attention?
I think the number one thing that I think of is privacy. I think that, once you're in the public eye, it's very hard to have a private moment as a person. And so your personal life, everything is under a microscope, and ways that, can be challenging, right? And so I think especially as a, woman, or even a Black woman, like, I personally, don't have children yet, for example, right? And so the process of, like, if I choose to have a family, like, all these decisions that people, make every day, become literally almost a public decision in a lot of ways, because you're justifying to the public why you're doing what you're doing, and how it will impact them as someone who's expected to, represent them. And many public servants take a different approach, right? I know some folks who are like, listen, it's still my life or whatever, but there's still consequences to every decision that you make. I think it's the, you know, along with that, it's really having to um be conscious of the things that you say, so that they're not taken out of context. Like, we're in a space where, we're living in clickbait soundbite era, right? Where, one thing that's part of a broader conversation is then taken and used against you. And so I think, that can be really, really challenging. But it's recognizing that when you choose to represent, communities and other people, a lot of times your personal life and who you are may come second to that. And that can be, straining on families. And in my case, I happen to, be a bachelorette, but I know people, in the space who, their marriages have become very strained. They're, relationships with their children have become very strained. And so I think there's definitely some significant trade-offs there. And but I also think if we've learned anything from um COVID, it's that we still have to be intentional about carving out, rest, carving out the care that we need to sustain, because it's very easy in public service world to burn out, right? And our communities need us, right? So we have to ensure that, maybe sometimes you're not giving everything because you have to reserve some for yourself. And everyone's not going to be happy. Sometimes it's a lose-lose with that, and you just have to be confident that you're doing the right thing.
What's given that, what parts of yourself do you feel have been most intentional about protecting yourself or any part of this process throughout this whole journey so far?
I think definitely carving out time for care and establishing clear boundaries, with my team. We talk about that all the time, just ensuring that there's some protected space. So, for example, Sunday mornings for me are for church. Um, Folks wanted to use that time to canvas communities, and I still canvas on Sunday, but I need to be grounded spiritually, and that's important to me, and just being unapologetic about that. And maybe I don't always make it to church in person, but I at least need to have the space to watch virtually, to worship. And that has been a excuse me, non-negotiable. But I think the latest thing is like, you got to stay in shape for your mental health and all those things. And so making sure that I'm blocking out proper time for workouts and all those things. You can't forget that you're a human, right? Because
Yeah,
your body will show
exactly.
you.
Yeah, right about that. But given that, when the work does feel heavy, what brings you clarity and grounding? You did just mention about being spiritually grounded and physically grounded, but is there
Mhm.
anything else that brings you clarity and such?
Um, I mean, that definitely is a huge thing. I think when things are heavy, finding space to kind of take a look at various scriptures, or even going back to look at other sermons that uh and not just my church and other spaces. I think that there's some great spiritual leaders, and really finding those messages that keep things grounded in something bigger, right, than what's happening. But outside of that, I would say, I have a very strong community around me. I have my sorority. I have I happen to be a part of a cigar community, and those spaces are immensely helpful in terms of that clarity space, because these are people who are invested in me, and they understand me in ways that maybe folks may not, and can offer guidance, can offer support, or also can offer that space of like, come get away, you don't need to be on with us, you can be yourself and just do what you need to do to let that energy out. And and so I think it's really important to have those spaces, those trusted spaces, because um again, like, we can't give all of ourselves to the public, and so that piece that's behind has to have a space to kind of you know shed some layers and
Sure. You
whatnot.
mentioned Cigar Club. Did I hear that correctly?
You did.
Oh, wow. So you got a good cigar.
I do, I
That's great.
do,
I like
I
that.
do.
Cool. But what does good leadership actually look like to you on an ordinary day? Not a big moment, but a regular one.
I think, leadership to me looks like listening and being with the people, right? And so I don't think it's always being the person speaking. It's not always the person who um even holds the power in the room, right? It's the person who's willing to create space, amplify, and advocate for not just the loudest person, but the person who hasn't even been given a key to the door. I can visually see it as like you're sitting in a boardroom with a group of people, and there's someone standing outside, and you invite them in the room because you think they need to be there, right? Like, leadership is sometimes doing the unpopular thing, but it's being able to kind of ensure that it's not about self, it's about whatever the mission and purpose and people that you're trying to serve.
Great to hear that for certain. Well, what's something about public leadership that has surprised you once you step in it or closer to it?
um hmm I'm
Take your
not
time. There's no
sure.
right or wrong answer.
I'm not sure that I've been surprised as much as I think that, you know, it's very important that while yes, transparency is great. It's important that you protect your information and who you are, and because you really don't know who may be moving not in your best interest. Um, and I say that to say that, you know, as a Black woman in this space, there are people, regardless of political party, regardless of, spaces that they work, who don't necessarily want to see you successful, right? And while, people may relish in, oh my gosh, you are such a qualified candidate, or, these are some of the things I've heard, there are also, again, people for various reasons who um may try to undermine you, and you won't see them coming because you assume that they're on your side. It's like the Judas
Yeah.
kind of motif, right? And we're always looking at the opposition and thinking that that's the problem, but I think it's, you can have folks on, that are on your side or on your team who that's not they're really working against you. And so it's very important to have some good discernment and ensure that you have like trusted people in your cabinet that you really know, who can help kind of spot those things when you're really just, moving through in the day to day and trying to ensure you have the right people on your team. And again, like I said, it's not that it's surprising. It's more so, eh, you just often don't, I think even the best of us don't see it coming, and it can be devastating depending upon what it is. And I've seen, folks in the public service space whose entire careers were tanked by their own, and I think that's the challenging world that we live in. But it's important that, you know, we also train the next folks who are coming up so that they're equipped and prepared, for those things.
Where do you think institutions misunderstand the communities that they're meant to serve? Especially over where in your LD, your legislative district that you're running for.
Mhm. Can you repeat the first part of that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you think institutions, just in general,
Mhm.
misunderstand the communities they're meant to serve, and more
Yeah.
specifically, tailor to the constituency in which you're seeking to serve?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I think, it's kind of back to my data conversation. I think most institutions think in numbers, right? And so they'll say things like, well, the electorate in legislative district 13 is, primarily white, and 58% of those voters are, over the age of, 50. And then you have this large pocket of Latino voters, but there will be a whole part of the electorate that's left out. So, for example, 13% of my electorate is East Asian, right? And with a large pocket of those being folks from Bangladesh. And then you have roughly, 6 to 7% who are Black. But because those numbers don't constitute what folks consider a critical mass, they get left out of the conversation. And so even when we're thinking about, targeting or focus groups or all those things, what are the different needs? Um, they're never really counted in that information. And so then when institutions are, looking at either providing resources or support or even programs, there's an assumption that there isn't a need there because they didn't collect that kind of data, or they have treated these groups as monoliths as opposed to recognizing the nuance of diversity that is within those groups, and so like even with our, Latino population, we are very mixed social economic community. While the majority of the district is fairly affluent, on the affluent side, we do have a strong working class community that has drastically different circumstances than the rest of the district, right? And so when you look at things in monoliths, things get missed, right? And they miss what some of the values are, right? Often, from a value standpoint, I think people often look at faith and faith-based values as something that falls in the conservative camp. Well,
Right.
there's plenty of us, like myself, who were very, spiritual. We're very grounded in those spaces, and we do belong to churches, but we may not necessarily consider ourselves conservative, and we're left like completely, out there as folks who haven't been engaged, right? So those are things that I see, particularly in my district.
Hear that for sure. What do you think about the intersectionality between the Latino, I'll use the term Latinx just for this conversation, even though I don't typically use that, and the Black community just in general? How is that intersectionality? Just given that just as a minority, there's obviously are more those who identify with being Hispanic or Latino compared to Black or African American. What is that intersectionality like, just from your observations, or even just from your time just living there and working and operating in these spaces? It's just as far as unity, or even when it comes to coalition building,
Mhm.
as it relates to your campaign, or just with similar values or issue advocacy, if that all makes sense to you.
Yeah, yeah, no, it does. I would say on the ground in my district, I think it's a little unique. The Latino and Black community have historically had very, very strong ties and relationships, particularly just going back to even like the early 1930s. And there's some organizations that were founded, kind of in response to that, that provided support and resources to their own, particularly because the cities would not do so, right?
Right.
And so there is a bit of that sort of connection for those longstanding families that exist in my district. Now, for folks who might be new or who have moved from other places, they may not be as tied into that dynamic, but I see a much more like harmonious relationship in my district. Now, outside of my district, right, this is a longstanding conversation. I think that there are, groups and communities that have had a similar experience as where I am in my district. But then there are others where I think it falls along social economic lines, where often I think, and I don't think that this is unique to Arizona, but you have a situation where when people are climbing the economic ladder, there's a tendency to move towards assimilationist practices.
Yep.
And because many Latino communities are able to assimilate differently, especially if they tend to be more white appearing, for example,
Right.
or those sorts of things. They tend to disassociate from the Black community and position themselves as separate.
Yeah.
And you even see that sometimes with folks who are African born, immigrants, right?
Yep.
And it's really about an economic mobility piece, right? How do I access this space? And to do that, I need to disassociate from this community, right? And so I think Arizona is no different in that. I think where we are now, though, is interesting. I think you often find that the communities come together when there's a common issue, interest convergence, right? So the current climate around immigration um, is an issue that crosses both groups in many ways, right? So while a large focus may be on brown people, we also have a contingent of East Africans, or a contingent of Haitians, or a contingent of Jamaicans, or folks who
Interesting.
are Black, that are also facing very similar issues around profiling and so on. And then the group that is often totally left out of this conversation, that is very, very big in Arizona, is our indigenous population, because
Yep.
sometimes, our native folk look Mexican, look, you know what
Yeah.
I mean? And so they're also profiled. And we have, 22 federally recognized tribes here in Arizona. And so I think right now there's somewhat of a collective piece around, how do we navigate these challenges? But it's usually never, um, it's usually short-lived, right? And as long as this is an issue, we're working together. But when it's not an issue, it's very challenging to work together. And I think where Arizona is different than, sort of other states is, our population percentage of, Black folks is relatively small. And so people treat it as it's not a critical mass, right? And when you add layers of, the Black population being very spread out, so most communities, um, have a population of Black people, but they don't exceed more than 6%, right? So there
Yeah.
isn't like a strong hold of a Black community kind of anywhere really in Arizona. And that comes from the history, right? Like
Yeah.
on one hand, the beauty of the history, there wasn't the kind of redlining that we've seen in the Midwest and other places. But the downside to that is when you don't have that critical mass, historically South Phoenix and a couple other places kind of served as that. But because people could move a lot of different places, when you don't have a critical mass, it's really hard to, fight for common issues. But people are doing it. So
That's good. And how long have you been in Arizona, Rocky, again?
So I've been in Arizona for 3 years,
Okay.
and but I, have ties here. I have family on my father's side that has sort of been here for several decades, and
Oh, okay.
on my mom's side, I have an uncle and aunt that moved here to work for Intel in the '90s, and I spent my summers here with their children, and so I've watched sort of the development and changes and shifts. In the Arizona environment. And so it's a unique experience being a sort of newcomer transplant while sort of having an understanding of some of the history.
Right. So you definitely have the homegrownness. I'll use that lazy term when it comes to Arizona. And that kind of leads to me asking, because you do have that homegrown experiences here, and you also can relate to the transient or
Mhm.
transplant side of things, as far as it relates to the Black community, as we were just talking, especially with the historical nature. You mentioned your sorority,
Mhm.
Delta Sigma Theta. What is it, does the Divine Nine culture like in Arizona when it comes to community building and
Mhm.
organizing? It's such, given that, let's be frank, it's not the South, or it's not no HBCUs obviously in
Mhm.
Arizona, and definitely not even the Midwest, but with a very
Mhm.
small, less than 10% or 5% even population in the whole state. What is the Divine Nine culture like when it comes to organizing, advocating, and community building and such?
Sure. So, um, on one hand, I think that sometimes people don't realize how long Black folks have been in Arizona. And so, we actually the legislature just acknowledged the first Black person to arrive in Arizona in the last legislative session in the late 1800s. And so the first Divine Nine chapters were founded here in the 1930s. And so they've been active. And what I would say is, part of the troubled history of Arizona is once there was an influx of sort of white nationalists. There was a lot of elements of terror that created some sundown towns and some other things that sort of limited the expansion and growth of some of the Divine Nine organizations, but they did exist at Arizona State as well as University of Arizona. And then, subsequent of that, creating alumni chapters in the Valley as well as in Tucson, and actively sort of working. But they were they weren't sort of super public. They were really working in their communities and growing in many ways independent of each other. And then when you fast forward, to now, there is, a concerted effort to really foster the D9 culture as staples in our community trusted organizations that will, advocate for, all kinds of, for us, at least it's voting rights and educational justice and so on. And most of the organizations have kind of similar issues that they address, but there is this concerted effort. And I think part of the beauty of it is with folks coming from all over the country and sometimes even internationally, you get a wealth of like experiences that make Arizona unique, right? And blending those things. The downside is there isn't necessarily like this feeling of Arizona D9 culture. Like, being someone who's originally from Ohio, like, I'm like, I know that is, an Ohio thing, right? Or a Midwest thing. There really isn't that feeling of this is an Arizona thing. But I think there is a beauty in being able to cultivate and create something that is entirely new while staying on brand with the organizations. And so, I mean, we have some heavy hitters in each of these organizations that have moved to Arizona who have brought with them, all the things that they've done in their organizations, you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
it's been amazing to kind of meet and work together with many of these folks. But we're still establishing ourselves as, partners in the community because, as we talked about, like, because Black communities are so spread out, it's possible that there are folks who have no idea who we are, right? if we're
Right.
if we're only working in Phoenix, if we're only, working in, Tempe and Scottsdale, right? Like, if I live in Randolph, which Randolph is a historical Black community in Arizona, farming community, I have no clue, who these folks are, right? And they're so far removed, but there's room there. And so those are the conversations we have about, like, there's a large population of Black people in the city of Maricopa. Well, it sits outside of most of our territories. Okay, well, how do we still extend and provide programming and partnership with community organizations so that people know that we're here as a resource, right? And so we're really kind of thinking through all of those things as we continue to grow. But we certainly have a stronghold, at least for Delta. We have 3 active alumni chapters in the Phoenix area, 1 in Tucson, and 2 collegiate chapters. And so we are actively doing the work. And you know, I think
Yeah, for sure. What kind of example do you hope your leadership sets, Rocky, regardless of the outcome of this race and all?
I think it's my hope that, my leadership shows what it means to be people first, ideology second. And what I mean by that is, every leader has an agenda. Most people, when they encounter you and they know you're running for office, will ask you what's your platform. I really, really love to lead with, what's important to you and how do we synthesize what's important to the community into a single, very clear, concise message. The goal is to be a representative. It's not about my platform. It's about you all, right? And so being people first, sometimes is more time consuming, right? You really have to spend the time to understand what people want, what people need, what gaps they have. And sometimes you're going to encounter people who are contentious, right? But like it's showing people that you will always be an ear. You won't stop it. No, you will try to problem solve. You will find ways to advocate even when it is tough. And that is what I think being people first looks like.
Perfect. And what's giving you hope right now? What's keeping you rooted when everything around you is just moving fast? Maybe what's certainly in this campaign that you feel real confident about that you're going to see this through completely and it's going to be positive.
Uh, I think honestly, I feel like this is it for me all the time. It's the youth. It's the youth. I know we feel that, younger people tend to vote less and, engage less, but they just engage differently, right? I love the way that, younger folk ask questions and they're like, "No, I'm not going to feel forced to engage with this system if the system doesn't work for me," right? And they're finding, and they're not stopping there, right? They're, forming organizations, they're doing advocacy work, they're, leveraging the tools that they know better than many of us, to really make an impact. Obviously, I think that there are other things that are different than prior generations. Their attention span, um, isn't typically the longest, but the outside of those things, they're just really critical and socially oriented. And I think we often get caught up in the loud noise of what's on social media or television, and feel as though our youth are so lost. I think there are things that youth can really glean from elders if we actually had those intergenerational conversations that would help sort of provide context and grounding and wisdom for them. But I really think, I have two interns on my campaign who they're still in high school. And the things that they're like managing and the ways that they think and the kinds of feedback they give, I'm like, they're sharp. We have some organizations that were founded by college students here in Arizona who, I mean, they're changing the entire landscape, and so, and I mean, on the flip side of some of what I believe, you also have an organization like Turning Point, right? That
Yeah.
is youth led,
Yeah.
right? It's youth led. So or driven, right? And so I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we discount the power of youth in this space.
Yeah. I mean, Charlie Kirk's funeral was right in your backyard, literally at at a State Farm Arena, or yeah,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So I mean, people could joke about Turning Point all they want, but
They're making an
they're
impact.
exactly.
And I'm like, we can't ignore that. And I think it's every generation, elders look at the next generation, they find all their faults. And I'm not saying there aren't faults, right? What I am saying is it's like you can't stop progress. Like progress in whatever ways is inevitable. How we shape it is not discounting it or ignoring them. It's figuring out how what we have to offer can help bolster or amplify what they're doing. And I think that's what we need to be doing, in terms of, I am who I am because of my elders. But part of it was they thought I too was precocious and didn't listen and thought I knew everything, but they didn't know I was absorbing the lessons and the things that they were teaching me and all of that. Like I am who I am because of those things,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is missing for our youth, right? The elders are
Yeah.
not talking to the youth the same way,
Right.
and they need that. But they are moving. I mean, every time I'm in a space with young people, like I am just amazed at some of the things that they do, and they're coming up with even entrepreneurial businesses. Like, I mean, they're doing some things, and it's not always going to play out on, what did Gil Scott Heron? The revolution won't be televised; it'll be live, right? Like, it's
Yeah,
not necessarily
for
going to be
sure.
on a screen. You got to be
For
out
sure.
there.
Well, you're definitely still young, so what's
Yes, no, yes, I am. Yes, I am. I
Yeah, we're the
am.
same age. Anyway, but when you think about the next generation, just quite frankly, Gen Z. When you think about Gen Z watching you, what do you hope that they get from you? How you move through this moment, and if someone of Gen Z or even younger, whatever the case may be, sees themselves in your story, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to see that this is possible, right? I think that, part of why many people I know don't choose to run for office is they think they have to have, a ton of money. They have to have, certain types of qualifications and connections and all of that. And while those things play a role in certain ways, it's recognizing that it is accessible, right? And um, you in me at least, hopefully, even a mentor. Like, I'm always open to connecting with young people. I don't have all the answers. I frankly can learn a lot from them, but in connection, it's hopefully they see me as someone who um will help, create space for them, and provide, guidance, to nurture whatever direction that they want to go. But I think I had folks who, when I was growing up, I thought were inspirational. I think it's weird to say you hope you inspire, you inspire folks, but if nothing else, I think it's seeing an example of, one example of, uh, I don't even want to say role model. A friend of mine uses the term real model instead of role model. Like,
Oh
I
wow, I
like
like that.
that because it's not about being, this exemplar, right? I'm not perfect, but I am a real example of what's possible, and hoping that the next generation can see that.
Perfect. Love it. Now, what does from classroom to Capitol mean to you beyond a campaign or a moment in time?
Yeah. I think it's about the transition from, what does it mean to facilitate learning to facilitating policy, right? And so I think it's that application. We often hear, especially when education is a space that doesn't necessarily work for some folks, that, education's overrated, but learning, a classroom can be anywhere. A classroom is not just in a school building, right? We can set up, folks, and I love the Nation of Gods and Earths, for example. They call it a cipher, right? You could cipher up outside. That's a classroom, right? But it's spaces in which we are learning and collectively growing, and transitioning that to the impact in terms of leading and changing the future direction for future generations. That's what it means to me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Rocky, for being here this morning and for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And I'm sorry about Ohio State again. I had to throw it in there.
Really, we that's what we're doing.
No, 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 no. I'm joking. But all seriousness, thank you for being here, Rocky. And you definitely have my support with your campaign. And we're just going to keep on marching forward through the primaries, through the general.
Yes, thank you.
All right. You have a good day, Rocky.
You too.
Bye bye.